There is very little information out there from the conspiracy theorists about where they think the mud originated from, nor the mechanisms that triggered the mud flood in the first place. Now, of course, mud flows of varying power and viscosity can overwhelm localized areas and are the result of such things as rivers flooding, liquefaction, tsunamis, and landslides. However, conspiracy theorists usually just quote the liquefaction article on Wikipedia. Wikipedia seems to be the go-to resource for conspiracy theorists. And they currently use this natural phenomenon as their preferred explanation of how the mud flood occurred. Other potential causes have been suggested by them, including dirt rain, volcanic ash, dust from space, vibrations caused by large church organs, and Noah's flood. So let's look at liquefaction. Liquefaction is a result of seismic waves caused by earthquakes and mainly affecting waterlogged sediments at or just below ground surface. The consequence of liquefaction is that soil can, for a brief period of time, act more like a liquid and can lead to the partial or even complete subsidence of man-made structures as the ground underneath becomes too soft to support the structure's weight. If the liquefaction is severe enough, whole structures can topple over. While a layer of soil and sediments can be left on the surface after the period of liquefaction has finished, it only does so on a local scale. However, mudflood proponents believe that the mud flood was a worldwide event. Liquefaction would be more likely to make a building lean over as the ground under it becomes too soft to support its weight. So a question would be, where are all the buildings tilted to one side as a result of the quicksand-like conditions created by liquefaction? Shouldn't many of these mudflood buildings be leaning to one side? None of them do. And since earthquakes are the cause of liquefaction, then all these grandiose mudflood buildings should also show clear evidence of earthquake damage. But again, they don't. None of these buildings are leaning or tilted, and none show evidence of earthquake damage. Clearly, something is wrong with mudflood belief and its overall acceptance of liquefaction. For a global mudflood to occur, there'd have to be global liquefaction. And for global liquefaction to occur, you'd need global earthquakes to occur simultaneously. But major earthquakes don't occur everywhere, and this map of the world shows the areas most affected by them. As you can see, there are many vast regions of our planet that experience no earthquakes and only the occasional tremor, and sometimes barely even that. So how could there be global earthquakes that caused the mud flood when huge areas of the Earth just don't experience earthquakes? As such, buildings that have been labelled as mud flood buildings cannot be used as evidence of a mud flood event caused by earthquakes and the resulting liquefaction, simply because none of them are tilting and none show signs of earthquake damage. A further point to consider is, what if there was little to no soil under and around a building, but the building itself still has windows partly below ground level? How were these buildings buried with no local waterlogged soil available, but still leading to liquefaction? For example, the Luna County Courthouse in Deming, New Mexico. The entire area, in fact virtually the entire state, is barren and dry, yet the courthouse shows elements of being a mudflood building. How could waterlogged soil and sediment rise up via liquefaction and partially bury this building when the land all around it and directly underneath it is dry bedrock with very little to no waterlogged soil? So how would the mudflooders explain this building? With little native soil about, how did it get partially buried? There is a straightforward way to determine whether the land directly surrounding supposed mudflood buildings is the result of a sudden mudflow. We begin with several layers of natural soil and geology, with a house later built on top. Then the mudflood comes along and partially buries the house. Later, People dig the house out, leaving the bottom floor below ground level. This is now classed as a mud flood building. Because the land surface has been raised, people now live above the original land surface. However, the way to prove if the mud flood occurred is to go and collect a core sample down through all the layers. If the mud flood was an actual event, then the core sample would reveal a thick mud layer with soil and detritus at the upper level. Below this level, you would then come across the original ground surface, then the layers of deeper soil and rock further down. Coring is a cost-effective and relatively simple method to physically reveal the different layers of substratum beneath a chosen area. Perhaps mudflood proponents could undertake such a procedure. And if one were to actually conduct a more intrusive excavation into the land adjacent to a mudflood building, one should expect to find physical debris mixed in with the mudflood, such as tools, clothing, human and animal remains, and other items that were buried. And if the mudflood did indeed occur in the mid-19th century, then the rubbish revealed should all be from that time period. If a global mudflood had occurred in the recent past, then it would have long ago been revealed by mining companies, archaeological excavations, property construction, geologists, seismologists, cartographers, landscape historians, the list goes on. None of these professionals have ever reported a mysterious mudflood layer. You will never hear an archaeologist say, "We have to dig through the 19th century mudflood layer first before we can get to the archaeological remains below it." It sounds better in a West Country accent. Apart from the localized nature of liquefaction and the fact that earthquakes don't occur everywhere, what would be the trigger for the mudflood in the first place? Mudflood proponents describe the mudflood as being sent to help erase the memory of a previous civilization by using the mud to help hide the physical evidence of that civilization. Some kind of civilization reset. This would indicate that there was a conscious decision taken by a person or persons unknown to instigate this mudflood. Therefore, the mudflood would have been a man-made event. But by who? As such, what device or system of technologies could have been employed to create a global mudflood? The answer is, there are none. There are no known or even theoretical devices that could achieve such a monumental and yet specific planet-wide level of destruction, and mudflood proponents themselves have yet to propose a satisfactory explanation. At this point in time, there is no viable or workable model for how the mudflood occurred, nor any form of quantifiable understanding of where the mud came from, and as such the mudflood hypothesis must remain a fiction.